Ladies and gentlemen, and younger people, welcome to the State Library of Victoria tonight, and I would say in the local Aboriginal language, Wominjeka, to the theatre, the Village Roadshow Theatre, for our discussion as part of the One Object, Many Stories discussion. My name's Bernard Callio. I'm the chair for tonight. I have been a Creative Fellow as part of the State Library's Creative Fellow program, and that was in 2013, and I and my collaborator, historian Alex McDermott, are still working on our comic book version of the story of Melbourne in the 1880s that we started here, very happily. I would like to also, I suppose, credit. They are on their way, we understand. Yes. I'd also like to say that we have. Maybe I'll do this first. Other bit first. I'll acknowledge that we are meeting and talking and thinking and questioning tonight on Aboriginal country. This is Aboriginal land. It always has been, and it always will be. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation, past and present. And these people who are, these mystery guests who are turning up, I'd like to credit them too. They're people with a very special interest in the book we are discussing tonight. It's special because it's their book. They own it. It's part of their culture, part of their story. So I anticipate the arrival of Father Joseph Mackay, OFM, Ordo Fratrum Minorum, the Franciscan Friars, who is the guardian of St. Pascal's Friary in Box Hill, and any fellow friars that he brings with him. So although tonight is called Medieval Flea, we are actually the object that will be under our gaze tonight, under our scrutiny tonight, is actually the time travel device by which that flea has reached us. It is a book, a 750-year-old book on loan from the Franciscan Friary in St. Pascal's in Box Hill to the State Library, and thus that loan is, of course, by extension, here they are. Not to embarrass them, but there they are. Welcome. Welcome, brothers. Wonderful. So this book, the Codex Sancti Paschalis, is the object which will divulge its stories tonight by two of its examiners and people who have been very involved in the story of that book. So Anna Welsh over here, who had got her PhD in 2011 from the University of Divinity at the Friary in Box Hill, is a book historian specialising in medieval manuscripts. Her monograph, Liturgy, Books and Franciscan Identity in Medieval Umbria, was published in 2015. And this book is very much a book about the book that we're going to be talking tonight. Anna co-curates The Mirror of the World, Books and Ideas, an exhibition here at the State Library on the fourth level of the dome, all about the story of the book. And the missal at the moment, the book under our consideration, is on display until October of this year. Katrina Ben, here, is a book conservator at the library. She has a BA honours in classical studies with philosophy. How great is that? What a combo. From the University of Melbourne. Initially training in book conservation here at the State Library. She furthered her study at the Centro del Bel Libro in Ascona, Switzerland in 1991. So to these two people who have been involved with the book, I think let us welcome them and thank them already. So let's start the discussion, which has been sort of broken up into 4 chapters, with this first chapter, making the book. And I will ask you, Anna, so this is a missal. What is a missal, and who are the Franciscans around its time of making?
Thanks, Bernard, and thanks for that very kind introduction. A missal is, the sort of basic definition is it's the book that a priest uses to perform the Mass. So it's got all the text and the music needed to perform the ritual of the Mass. And it's a form of liturgical book that came about in around the 9th century. Before then, people needed lots of different books to say the Mass. You had one book with all the text in it, one with all the music, all different codexes were needed to perform that ritual.
So you'd be reaching from one to the other on the...
Yeah, that's right. And so the missal is a kind of innovation to bring everything into one book, a kind of compilation book that lets you perform the Mass from just one text.
And is this an early missal, or has the missal tradition been going a little while?
It's been going for a couple of hundred years by the time this book is made.
Okay.
And this particular one is made, and I think we might have some images here. So this is the missal that we're talking about and that you'll see afterwards. That's what it looks like today.
Yep.
And maybe the next slide, I think. This is an image that shows you, it's actually really difficult to find an image of, a medieval image of a priest performing the missal using the Mass. And part of the reason for that is that the words are there almost as a prompt, in that the priest would know the text so well that they're not literally reading every single word from the book in front of them. And here you can see the missal is actually closed on the altar, sitting next to the chalice. So it's there, but it's not being read from in a kind of literal way.
So giving you confidence, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the presence there, it's there.
Yeah, it's there to refer to,
Yeah.
and we'll be able to see that when we see some more images of this particular Franciscan missal, the way that the text is really heavily abbreviated, and there are sort of little conventions that the scribe uses, little signs that show you when a word has been shortened to leave out some letters, because you don't need to write it out in full when you know it off by heart anyway. It's there really as a reminder.
Prompt.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the next image might, that's great. So the group of people who caused this book to be made and participated in making it were the Order of Friars Minor, and it's so lovely to have Joe and Jim here with us tonight. And I think that's a really good way of framing this conversation, is to say, as Bernard did, that this is a book that is not a museum object or an art object. It's very much part of a living tradition, a living culture. So the Order of Friars Minor were founded by Francis of Assisi, and this is an image of Francis in an allegory of marrying Lady Poverty. And it's a fresco that's from the Lower Basilica in San Francesco in Assisi, so the major church of the Franciscan order.
And that's Lady Poverty on the
That's Lady
right
Poverty
there?
on the right, and Christ in between, and Francis marrying poverty. And I chose that image because it really sums up what's at the heart of Franciscan charism and spirituality, is a dedication to humility and poverty and simplicity, and living a life that is as close as possible to the life of Christ and his apostles. So Francis was a person who went through a really intense religious conversion. He grew up as a rich young man in a merchant family in Assisi in the 12th century, and then he undergoes this massive change of heart, where the things that he used to love doing, drinking with his friends and running around with girls, he doesn't want to do anymore, and he changes his whole way of life and begins to dedicate himself to God and to live in a simple way in the countryside. And the sort of the great, it's not an irony, that's not the right word, but the kind of the beauty of what happens to Francis in a way is that he tries to live this very simple life outside the city, away from people, but it's a hugely attractive way of life. And so very quickly people begin to join him, and the world that he tried to leave behind almost comes with him. And he founds an order, in effect, by accident, in a way. And by the middle, so this is around 1209, that the people begin to join him and follow his way of life. And by the middle of the 13th century, there are 30,000 Franciscan friars.
Sorry, how many?
30,000 around Europe. So it's a huge, they become a really intrinsic part of the church from that point onwards, and remain so today.
And I have an image of St. Francis flocked by animals, a friend of the animals. Is that true?
There's absolutely some truth to that.
Right.
Although, as a historian, I would unpick it in lots of complex and
Yeah,
boring
he had
ways that I won't.
deers eating out of his hand and sparrows landing on his head.
Yeah,
and-
that's true. That's true. No, he's known as a figure who embraces the importance of creation and nature in his spirituality, and so that's a part of his dedication to a way of life that is as close as possible to God, and part of that is by enjoying the natural world and by treating it respectfully, which is a reason he's become a real figurehead of the environmental movement in the 20th century and beyond.
Wonderful, wonderful. Should we get another one of these?
So I think the next slide we have.
What's going
Just
on
going to
there?
look a little bit about the process of making a manuscript, and Katrina's going to jump in at a certain point.
So the physical side of this missal is it's a book made of vellum, which is an animal skin, and these images are medieval depictions of making the vellum. So you'd essentially have your animal skin, wash it, soak it in lime, and then that lime enables the hairs to be removed. The skin is then stretched, as you can see there, on a wooden frame, usually a much bigger frame than that, and scraped to remove all the flesh from the other side, and then dried on that frame, further scraped, pumiced, made into a beautiful smooth sheet. And then from that point, it's moved to the person who's going to write on it. And in this case, with our missal, I'm going to pretend this is a sheet of vellum. This missal is made from nearly 200 sheets, and each single sheet is folded once. And if you look at the missal, you'll notice there's a crease in its forage. And if we could slip to the next slide, next one, you can see there's a bit of a sort of some undulations along the forage, the long edge of the book, and that's a result of the spine running along horizontally along each sheet of vellum.
The spine of the animal.
The spine of the animal.
Oh, the spine. Right, there's this.
Yeah. So
Yes,
this is made from nearly 200 animals.
Which animals?
Well, initially,
Good
it had been visually identified as being goat skin, and visually,
By a goat?
No. Visual identification's a little problematic. You've kind of got to, look at a lot of skins and so on and so forth. A couple of years ago, there was a project started at the University of York where they looked at how do we actually analyse these skins without damaging them, because we don't want to do a DNA test and cut a piece off. And they came up with this brilliant technique of running an eraser, like the sort of eraser you'd use when you do your comics,
Yes.
and producing a couple of eraser crumbs. And the process of doing this would pick up one or two loose fibres from the skin. We'd then send that to the University of York, who would put it through a mass spectrometer,
Yes.
which would separate the proteins in the fibre and give us a really clear reading of what it was. And it turns out this is goat.
It is goat. Ah, what a relief.
It's goat, it's not
Yeah,
calf.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
okay.
technology is quite fascinating
Yeah.
way of kind of getting a deeper look at what things are made of.
So that line there, that is the spine edge of the skin.
The ripple that you see
The
going
ripples.
vertically down.
Going down. Ah,
is the
okay.
mark of the skin stretched over the spine of the animal.
Okay. Wow. All right.
And yeah, with the previous slide,
Yes,
you
can we go
can
back to there?
see those little spots. They're actually hair, the pores where the hair follicles were attached to the skin. And with skins like this one, you can actually see one side has those little follicles, the other side doesn't. So you know you're looking at the hair side and the flesh side of the skin.
And we write on the hair side.
We write on both sides.
On both sides.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. One side better than the other, or?
Well, they tended to assemble the leaves so that you'd have hair on hair and skin on skin, so that at least it looked kind of uniform.
Yes.
But I think the skin, the the skin side's going to be a smoother surface, but you can't afford not to use both sides. Yeah.
It's expensive to make. It takes a long time. Yeah. Okay, great. Vellum, all right. What's next here? Should we?
Yeah, so I guess at this point, after the skins have been prepared in the way that Katrina was describing,
Yes.
then they're passed to the scribe to actually do the writing.
Scribe or scribes?
Often only one scribe per book, but it could be multiple. It depends on the situation, really. And in liturgical books are a different category to other types of manuscripts in that they tend to be produced within monasteries or by the friars themselves. The scribes would be friars, and we have some good evidence of that in this particular missal. Whereas other books, if they were, say they were, romances, Grail literature, they could be produced by a commercial atelier, a workshop that are beginning to spring up at exactly this time, really. The early 13th century is the beginnings of the publishing industry, as we know it.
Books for sale, but this is not a book for sale. This is a book for keeping,
use,
making.
That's right. Yeah, and so made within its community, with a scribe who was probably a friar, but actually with an illuminator, or several illuminators who were commercial in this case. So it's a kind of hybrid, an example of the way that monastics and friars would be working with commercial artists as well as with artists within their own orders.
Okay, and is there? Do you know from like the handwriting? Have you done looked at that? Does it look like it's all from the one?
It does in this case, but we can see at the end of the book there are additions that have been bound into it at a later point in the 14th century, and they're in different hands. So you can clearly see a difference in the age of the script and its style. But it does look like one uniform hand throughout the original manuscript.
Wow.
Mm.
And what's the picture, the black and white image we've got there?
I just chose that one because it's a famous and it's a lovely image of what it's like to work in a scribal workshop, which is not all fun and games, because you see down the bottom is the apprentice who's copying, he's practicing drawing decoration for the manuscript, and up above is his master who is angrily cursing the mouse who's stealing his cheese for his lunch. So it wasn't easy being a scribe.
And it's sort of one of those career moments of who moved my cheese, sort of who's eating
That's
my
one way
cheese.
of looking at it. And the other image I just chose because it's a really lovely example of the way in which medieval manuscripts are often really very playful books. And there's a sense of humour about the way that they're written. And in this case, you have an image of the scribe who's drawn, he's been painted into the manuscript, and he's actually writing his name out as the scribe within the manuscript. So it's pretty meta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I hate to bring everything back to comics, but that reminds me of Sergio Aragonés in Mad magazine. Yeah, the marginals. He used to put those tiny little drawings around the edges of the...
Yeah. Oh, well, this is the early origins of that practice. So, humour in the margins. Yep.
Life in the margins. Excellent, excellent. Okay, let's... Oh! What's this?
Yeah, these are images that I found online. They're from a project that's occurring at Birkbeck College at the moment, and I just thought it was interesting to show this is ink being made, one particular recipe of ink, which is a really common ink, and it is the sort that was used in this missal, iron gall ink. And Katrina might want to say something about ink. Maybe not. No, that's fine.
Well, we know it's iron gall ink. We had the... when we disbound this manuscript when it was under conservation, we had some analysis done to work out what the pigments were, and in fact the analysis confirmed it was iron gall ink. It showed presence of iron, different compositions throughout the manuscript, so perhaps they were using different recipes. But yeah,
because you'd run out of, I mean, it's a long book. How many?
I guess
it
many
is.
folios are there?
I should know that off the top of my head, but it's around 400 folios.
100.
Yeah, because it's actually, oddly, it's been paginated at a certain point, not here at the library.
Yeah.
So most manuscripts, when you look at them, have their folio number written, which is, so each folio has a recto and a verso, a front side and a back side. And those are the numbers that people working with manuscripts use to refer to it. So you'd say folio 37R and folio 37V for each side of the sheet. But in this manuscript, weirdly, it's been paginated, so it's always difficult to know how to refer to it because you want to go to folios, but the number written on it is a page number. So it's got about 800 pages.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just keep coming back to the idea that one person, one guy, one Franciscan, pretty much wrote out all the words.
I think if you go forward, we have a nice, perfect, next one. This is a really close-up image, and I probably should have provided one that shows you how close it is, but hopefully you'll come upstairs and see the book afterwards. It shows you a prayer that's written at the very end of the last folio of the original part of the Missal.
Oh, yes.
Which is written by the scribe, and it's a prayer that goes back to the 4th century in the text, its structure, but it's been used here by the scribe as a way of sort of signing off on finishing the project of writing this book, and he talks about himself as an unworthy priest, which is one way that we know that it was not a commercial scribe who produced this manuscript.
Yes, yes.
But you can see it's big on the screen now, but when you see it in real life, it's almost impossible to read by the naked eye these days because there's damage to it, but it's a really tiny script.
And so, yes, please do come up afterwards to the upper room, interestingly, and you can look at the actual book itself, but the writing at the top there is sort of in the usual size throughout the book. So you can see that this tiny writing here. Interesting, even the font size really expresses humility, doesn't it? So
absolutely, yeah. And they are, medieval scribes are really good at using different font sizes to break up the look of a page as well, and use a slightly different script to indicate an instruction to a priest versus the text that you actually say aloud. So there's a lot of kind of visual decisions being made along the way by the scribe as he's copying out this text.
Also, it gives voice. It seems to give voice to different areas of the text.
Absolutely, and it is, this is a performative text at its heart. It's there to be spoken, not to be read silently. I just put that other image on the screen just to remind us all that women were scribes as well. Not in this case, not of this book, but there were women who were both authors and scribes working in the commercial book production industry. So.
And in nunneries as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In the convents, in the nunneries, but also in the commercial industry, there were often husband and wife teams who were book producers.
Okay,
yeah.
Amazing. I mean, we sort of need to get on to using the book because otherwise we'll run out of...
No, we've got to get to the Flea.
Yeah, I know. I'm very excited. Okay, so, but we should talk... Katrina, can you want to talk about those buckets there?
What we're looking at here is a range of different pigments that are mixed up to use for creating the decorated capitals and illuminations. And I think if we try the next image, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that, we had the good fortune to go to the National Gallery of Victoria and have their assistance in analysing the pigments in this missal. This is a picture of what we used. It's an X-ray fluorescence analysis scanner. This is actually analysing a different manuscript, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And it will give you the element if there are any minerals in the pigment, and from that you can then work out what the likely pigment was. So if we go back an image, the blue there that's used in our manuscript was azurite because it had copper in it, so we're quite sure it was azurite. It wasn't lapis lazuli.
Yeah.
And the red, which you can see in the text, had mercury in it, which means we know it was either vermilion, which was a manufactured pigment with mercury in it, or it was cinnabar, which is sort of similar chemical composition, but it's naturally found. So it's one of those two. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a result on the pinks and purples because they're most likely to be sort of dyes that don't have minerals in them.
Okay.
And obviously there's gold. There's also a little bit of silver.
Gold as in gold?
A gold leaf.
Gold.
Yeah,
real gold?
Real gold, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, and these images, the few that we skipped over, which we should probably keep skipping
Yeah,
over,
we should
but they're
keep
just
skipping.
to give a sense of the fact that this book, part of studying a manuscript like this is trying to identify when it was made, where it was made, and the decorative style can be really important in helping you understand where it was made.
Yes.
And these images are, this decorative style is really distinctively from Perugia, the capital of Umbria. So if you go, I think, just quickly to the next one as we're
Next one
moving
on?
through. Yep.
One from
after
here?
that?
No?
No, it's gone. Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
We'll stick on this guy. But
Who's this guy?
This is a man who is showing us what this book probably looked like when it was first made, or something very similar to this. This is a binding for a missal, and you can see the date of the painting is a little bit later, but the book itself is very similar to this missal, and the binding is quite characteristic of the binding that was used on missals in that period.
Okay.
And that's part of what informed Katrina's decision making when she was working on the new binding, which we'll get to.
New binding. There's
bit
a new
later
binding
on.
coming up.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, should we go back to that picture?
Yeah, sure.
of,
But speak quickly.
I'll speak quickly, yes. If you look on the outside of the boards, you'll notice there are little pieces of metal. In the trade, we call it furniture. So there's little bosses and little clasps.
Yep.
Sometimes you find little corners attached to the boards as well. And now if we move on to the next slide, you can see this is the first page of our missal, and we've got little rust spots. So this shows us that the original binding had metal furniture, that these rust spots are from nails that held the furniture onto the wooden boards. And
But that metal furniture wasn't on the book when this
long gone. And in fact,
Old furniture.
interestingly, if you go to the end of the original part of the text, because as you remember, Anna said there were a few pages added in the 14th century. These rust holes are on the end of the original text, but not on the end of the extra pages.
Yep.
So you can tell at that point, those pages were added, it was rebound.
Yes.
That's pretty much it for what we know about the first binding. It had metal furniture.
Okay, metal furniture.
And it was probably red.
It was probably red, yeah.
Quite uncomfortable metal furniture. Yeah, for the book as well. Okay, so here we are with using this book. And Anna, again, so can you tell us, how did this book first feature in the religious life of the Franciscans who made it, basically?
Well, as we've said, it's a missal, so it's the book used by the priest to perform the Mass. But within the Franciscan context, it's got a really interesting role because books were a troublesome issue for the friars in the early years of the order.
Why?
Well, because they constituted property, and the part of the vow of poverty and the adherence to a life of apostolic simplicity was to not have property.
Of course, once you've got a book, then you need bookshelves.
That you are almost exactly quoting Francis of Assisi. He said, there's a famous story that's recorded in one of the early lives where a young friar says, I can't read very well, but I'd like to have a breviary. And Francis says no, and some of the other friars think that's a bit harsh, why not? And he says, well, if he wants a breviary, soon he'll want a bookshelf, then he'll want a big chair, then he'll want, it'll lead
it's a
to more
slippery
and more.
slope. The book is a slippery slope.
The book is a slippery slope, absolutely. But what's interesting, I guess, for us with this book in thinking about what it meant to the community that first used it is that even though it is a book and it's a form of property, it's completely essential to their spiritual life. So books like this missal and breviaries and personal prayer books, other books of that kind, are a sort of grey area for the Franciscans because they are not sure how to navigate this vow of poverty and this adherence to Francis's vision for their life, for their communal life, with the realities of living in a community and performing the Mass and performing Mass for lay people as well. So
a copy of the Iliad, on the other hand, would be difficult to argue.
Difficult to argue, but
okay.
not impossible, depending on your legal expertise.
Sure.
One of the most famous kind of Jim and Joe are laughing down there. One of the most famous kind of interventions into the Franciscan life came in 1230. So Francis dies in 1226. And by 1230, there are big problems within the order about exactly how to live the Franciscan way of life. What does it mean to be a Franciscan? And so they appealed to the Pope, Gregory IX, who you won't need me to tell you, is a lawyer when you hear this solution. So they say one of the issues that the friars approach him about is books and the ownership of books. And he says, basically, no problem, they're all my books and I'm lending them to you. Great lawyer's solution to the problem of ownership.
The situation with this book, like it belongs, actually, weirdly, it belongs to the Franciscans, but they're lending it to the people of Victoria.
That's true, there's some sort of poetic justice there. I think we've got some images.
Yes, we do. Let's get to the crucifixion.
Yeah. So this is an image I chose just to show, not a missal, this is a choir book and a group of friars singing together from the book. But if we go to the next slide, this is the most important opening of the missal. It's the page of the Mass, it's the text of the canon of the Mass, so that's the most solemn and central section that leads up to the ritual of communion. And you can see its importance through the presence of the miniature, as it's called, the illuminated image that you see there of the crucifixion.
Would that also be produced by a Franciscan inside the monastery?
No, most likely that would have been a commercial artist, but it's a bit of a mystery who it would be. Because it's of much greater quality, this image, and the quality of the artist is much higher than most other missals of this period. So that's an unanswered question for researchers of the future. If they can find other examples of work by this person, that would be really interesting. But what we show here in a little detail of that image is a spot of wax that is on this page. And it's one of the many signs of use that the book tells us really how it was being used physically. We know what it means theologically, we know, historically how a missal was used, but it's the kind of signs, the things that Katrina finds in her work on the book that really illuminate for me as a historian what the book meant and how it was being used in a very literal kind of sense. So the presence of the wax drop shows us, of course, the presence of candles and the environment of the Mass, which makes you think about how that image would look in candlelight and the effect of light on illuminated images, the presence of the gold, the kind of sensory experience of using this book. You can read a lot just from that little wax splodge, or you can if you're imaginative anyway, which historians have to be.
All readers, I would argue, yes. We don't. But we have on the left-hand page there, not text, but we talked about this before, we looked at it before upstairs, this is song, right?
Yes, that's right. So this is musical chant that's a part of the Mass, and that's, as I was saying at the start, the kind of innovation of the Missal was to bring this music into the book itself rather than having it in a separate book. And so it shows you, for musicologists, it's a really important era of development of the stave, the musical stave, that we're in a transition period before they settle on the 5-line stave. It's nearly there. They're at 4 lines at this point. But it's this is still chant that is performed today and that can be read by people who perform the chant.
Okay.
And that was I had a really lovely moment when I was first working on this book as a student. My younger brother was in a cathedral choir for a long time, and he looked over my shoulder once at a photo on my computer that I was, feverishly transcribing, and just started singing it. And it was a really lovely, example of what you were saying about the time travel.
Yeah,
These
absolutely.
are time machines in that sense.
Brilliant. Okay. Next.
Yeah, keep going.
Oh,
There's just a nice close-up, but I have to say nothing does it justice compared to seeing the real thing, so we'll see it upstairs afterwards.
And you were saying before that the text travels down the side of this image here.
That's right. It's we were talking about the relationship of text and image in books like this, and really there's an integration there that the text is never separate from image in a medieval book. And here down the right-hand side, you can see the words te igitur, which are the first words of the canon of the Mass, and they're actually part of the image, and then the text continues underneath in normal script. And often in crucifixion miniatures of this period, the T of the te igitur is the cross itself. So you literally read from within the image out and then down again. So it gives you a sense again of the way in which this book was used in a performative way by the people who first commissioned it.
Also, just the planning, indeed, of the writing and going, if we're going to send it out to be illustrated, we need to let that person know that they need to put the word in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do find lots of mistakes in medieval.
Okay.
I think we'll keep going, maybe.
great.
Yep.
Oh, Katrina, what's going on here?
Now it's time for me to talk about the use of the book. When we were conserving this book, the first thing we had to do was pull it apart, and it was apparent that there was a lot of debris in the inner margins. As a conservator, I don't like changing the physical state of anything. In this case, we did have to brush this out because to re-sew it, we'd have these little bits of grit caught between the pages. It wasn't going to work very well.
So to resell it.
Re-sew. When I was
Re-sew.
re-sewing, you don't want little
Don't
bits
tell
of
those
dirt.
guys.
So
Re-sew.
I had to go through and brush out at each opening, and it actually ended up being quite fascinating because there was lots of different sorts of debris. There was dust and dirt and little bits of trimmed parchment, but I also found little bits of glass. If we flip to
Next
the
picture?
next slide,
Yeah.
little bits of glass.
Whoa, it's disgusting.
Fibres that might have been bristles or hair, little bits of glue, all sorts of things. And amongst that, I actually
Drum
found
roll.
drum roll. I found a lot of insects. Now, all of this goes to show that the missile was very heavily used.
Sure, and not just by humans.
Well, it really demonstrates that it was probably left open for periods of time, particularly at that Te Igator image.
Yeah, that's right. And Katrina
There was actually double the amount of
Goop.
stuff down
Yeah,
the centre of
yeah,
that
right.
opening, which demonstrated that it was clearly open there for
catcher.
a very long time.
which confirms what historians would always say about how, books like this would be kept open at that page in a church for people to be able to see the image between masses. And exactly this is evidence of what otherwise we sort of say, we tell ourselves, but
Yeah.
we don't necessarily have the proof.
Have the backup. It's
That's
like
right.
you guys working together like a
Katrina's
forensic team.
making us truthful. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, next.
So the next slide. One of the things I brushed out was a little tiny flea.
Where did this little tiny flea live on? Who did it live on originally, do you think?
That's going to be a question for filmmakers of the future.
But isn't
we
it
don't
a
know.
rat? Yes.
It's
It's
an
a rat flea.
Oriental rat flea, and they were known to be the fleas that carried plague. Of course, we don't know that this flea dates to the origin of the manuscript, but
No, but I mean, the book was in Italy at the time that the plague was in Italy. We don't have any proof, and it would require further testing of the flea to a serious immigration interview for the flea to find out exactly where
Give it
it
an
came
English
from.
test, and yeah, that
Yeah,
works.
that's right. We'd have to be pretty strict about
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
But at this point, we couldn't say, we wouldn't guess that it's definitely from that period, but it's totally possible that it is. And
Plague flea.
yeah, that's right. And it, it's, as Katrina was saying, it's part of a whole cast of characters that were found inside the manuscript, and all of them have more to tell us about where it's been.
Not just a flea, but
so
collection.
Yeah, quite a few spiders. The upper.
Daddy Longlegs up there, isn't it?
Yep, daddy longlegs, beautifully preserved silverfish.
Lovely.
Some of these may even be box hill insects. We don't know.
And as I was saying earlier, I don't want to change anything if I can avoid it. So I've actually left these in the manuscript
These are still there.
because they're not doing any harm. They're useful potentially
You're a very
later down the
permissive
track.
person. That's great.
My job's not to clean the manuscript
No.
and make it beautiful.
No.
It's to preserve it and make it safe to be handled.
And this is an unknown down here? This
Yeah,
is
that's an
The
unknown.
unknown
If
insect.
anyone recognises this, but please contact us afterwards.
We were actually fortunate enough to have the assistance of some staff from the Museum Victoria
museum.
to actually identify.
I see it's
Which is why we know for sure what our flea was.
Yeah, great. Great.
Yeah.
Well, that's remarkable. So these animals have travelled through how many unknown centuries, really, in this TARDIS of a book.
That's right. And it
and-
would be, it would be possible for someone to do some further analysis of that
Yeah.
at another point. And, that's the beauty of working with books like these, is that the study's never over. There's always going to be new questions for someone else to come along and ask. No matter how many years you spend researching it, you'll never finish. So
Yeah. An ongoing treasure chest. Shall we go on?
Yes, I think we have
let's go
some
on.
plague imagery, just to keep the energy up in the
Keep
room.
the energy and the plague in the room.
Yeah.
Someone is being buried here.
Yeah, so I just thought it would be worth giving then some social context of the plague and the enormous impact that it had on really the whole world, but particularly on European culture. The plague is, of course, the bubonic plague, but also pneumonic and septicemic plagues that existed. And the bubonic plague was carried by the rat flea that we've met. And sometimes bubonic plague could turn into pneumonic plague, which could be transferred via droplet infection. So the plague was contagious in that pneumonic form. And when it broke out, there was an outbreak in the 6th century known as the Plague of Justinian. And then in the 14th century, there was a big outbreak that killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people, which was a third of Europe's population at the time. So you get socially then enormous change, obviously, huge mortality rate, and no certainty about exactly how the disease works or how to avoid it. But there are famous poems like Boccaccio's Decameron, where it gives us a sense of how some people reacted to the plague anyway, which was basically just to avoid it, just to move to the country, get into the fresh air, because it was thought to be an airborne illness. And it really, the trauma that this visited on the communities where plague broke out is immense, and it has a huge impact on the religious and social culture and the artistic culture of Europe from the 14th century onwards. Although some people have argued that you probably wouldn't have had the Renaissance without the plague, so it's not all bad. But
it's very optimistic.
Well, silver linings. The mortality rate in the end created opportunities for some people, because with fewer people in the community, there was more mobility. People were able to change their station in life. And if we go on to the next image, this is Sebastian, who was a plague saint invoked against the plague, and he was thought to be efficacious because, as you see here, he's being shot with arrows, which is the famous iconography of Sebastian. But he didn't die from those wounds, and so he's important as a plague saint because you will also have wounds all over your body. That's how the plague, forms into buboes in all the joints, really, the armpits, the neck, the groin. But hopefully, if you pray to Sebastian, you won't die of those wounds, just like he didn't die of his arrow wounds. So he becomes an important saint to invoke against the plague. And here you see an image of him being an intercessor. And you can see that a sort of dramatic evocation of the 7th century plague here.
Sebastian, help us.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we keep going.
Yes.
So another of the books that we're going to show tonight upstairs is just to give a sense again of the culture around what the plague did in European society. This increased emphasis on death and the fragility of life, and the series of images that became really powerful and much repeated in various different formats, known as the Dance of Death, the Dance Macabre. And Hans Holbein's imagery of the Dance Macabre becomes the kind of standard imagery of death and of the omnipresence of death, really, and the fact that he attacks everyone high and low just the same as the plague did.
So we have a few images now and a book upstairs in our viewing room.
We can skip over.
We're going to need to
move forward.
So sorry, no, this is very fast. But there we have the death. Dancing with a bishop there?
Yep, even bishops are in trouble.
Even bishops are in trouble. Not safe as... Okay, so owning the book. This is an interesting question here. It's travelled through not only time, as we've just discussed, and survived the plague, as we've just discussed, but it's also travelled through space. And so, again, we probably need to zook this so that we can give these people... If you think of a question, think of a question.
Get to the
Okay, go.
Well, we'll just skip over quickly then. So I think it's more interesting to hear about what Katrine is going to say about this man, Thomas Phillips. Yes. But essentially, just all we know about its use in the medieval period is it was made for a community in Perugia. It was used in that region probably for a few hundred years.
So it survived the plague in Perugia?
Well, it would have been, yes, it would have been in Umbria, yes.
Okay.
And then it turns up, really there's a blank in the historical record until 1798, when it turns up in a Roman bookseller's list and ultimately ends up in the library of this man, Thomas Phillips, who was a self-described velomaniac who was obsessed with
maniac.
collecting books, collecting manuscripts. But if I hand over to Katrina, she'll be able to talk about the evidence around this period of the manuscript.
Yeah, well, Philip's, you can see here his seal, which is on the inside of the front board of his binding. If we zip to the next slide, Philip's for 3 years employed a binder called George Bretherton. This is his binder's ticket, so Bretherton Legavit. He bound it in 1848. And this is the binding that the missal had when it came to the library here. It's a very basic binding. I think maybe the next, that's a picture of what the binding was like. And we've actually got the binding upstairs to look at. We've hung on to it even though we've removed it.
Because you never throw anything out.
It tells us a lot about part of the book's history. So I have a suspicion Phillips didn't want to spend too much money on fixing things up. He wanted to spend his money on purchasing manuscripts. But I would imagine this arrived to him in an unbound state. There's some evidence that it spent some time in an unbound state. There's a lot of soiling sort of in the areas you'd expect to see if it wasn't sewn.
Okay.
And so Bretherton re-sewed it. It made new holes, re-sewed it in the 19th century style. I won't go into details, but for a book like this, it actually wasn't such a great idea. The next slide will show you, in fact, the binding's just wrapped around it. It was not attached. It was originally attached. Bretherton's given it a very thick spine lining. And yeah, it kind of fell apart. Sort of like if you
got to you.
It's how it came to us. Yeah. If you can sort of imagine the Incredible Hulk sort of bursting out of his clothing,
Yeah, sure.
It's kind of what's happening with this book and this binding. The book is stronger than the binding. It's not. The bindings like this work for paper. This is not paper. And also the sewing's breaking down, and this is where we get really worried and decide some action needs to be taken, because if you're handling a book like this and the sewing's not intact, then you start getting the pages rubbing against each other, and it's something we don't want to have happen, having ink or pigment rubbing, abrading. So hence conservation was done 10 years ago.
I go on?
You may go on.
Oh.
I was just going to, I guess, say quickly how it actually did come to Australia too. The book was in Philip's collection, and Phillips is a really fascinating character who deserves his own evening. But he amassed 60,000 manuscripts in his lifetime, left very clear instructions that they were to be kept together as a library after his death. But he had also basically forced his family to move out of their mansion to make more room for books. So as soon as he died, they started selling the books.
Slippery slope.
That's right. And it took it took more than 100 years. The last sale of Philip's manuscripts was in 2006. So he died in 1872. That's how long it took to clear his library.
I would say. All that time.
That's right. So the book ended up in the stock of a London bookseller, W.H. Robinson, in the 40s. And in 1949, they decided to send out lots of Philip's manuscripts here to Australia with the hope that a rich citizen would buy the books for the State Library. So it was shown, it was on display here in the library, and at that point, the Guardian of St Pascal's at the time saw the book and decided that the friars would like to have it back, essentially, to own it again.
There's no good showing it to the Franciscans, they don't have any money.
Well, indeed they didn't, and so there was a kind of a showdown really in Catholic Melbourne of who are you going to support, the friars or the library, to buy this book. And in the end, a donor came forward and gave the friars the money to purchase the book, and the library stepped out of the way and allowed the friars to buy the book back. So it went to Box Hill at that point, and it was in the library there in Box Hill until 1993 when it was placed on long-term loan here at the library for reasons of conservation, so that it could be cared for in the best possible environment. And this is an image you see here of two friars, including Jim, who's with us tonight, and Father Angelo O'Hagan, who passed away last year, who were with the book at the time that Katrina completed the rebinding in 2007 in the lead up to a big exhibition. So I'll let Katrina go back to the...
Great. And it looks like from the red there that it is the new binding there.
The new binding.
Post
And it's terrible
conservation.
pun.
We
Yes, so
yes.
we have a look at the actual conservation work.
Let us do that.
So yeah, the book was completely resewn. And I should say that the idea behind this binding is not to actually create a replica, but to use features of medieval binding style that work well, that best serve to protect the book. So the sewing style here actually is based on what would have been, how it would have been sewn in Italy at the time. However, I decided best not to put any adhesives on it. Adhesives, anything with moisture is not going to do the vellum any good. So it's going to be totally non-adhesive, and so I've actually included a lining there to protect the backs of each of the...
Which are those bands coming down?
The lining is the piece of paper behind the bands.
Okay.
The bands will attach the book to the binding. So if we slip to the next slide, you can see I'm actually attaching those bands, the sewing supports, to the binding.
And the boards are made of?
The boards are made of an archival board. We did look into replacing the boards with proper medieval style wooden boards, but getting boards, quarter cut boards of that size in a short time period proved not to be possible. And we know for certain that these boards are not going to do any damage. There's no risk of any acid migration or anything like that. So it actually was a good decision, I think. And then, of course, we have to cover the boards. So I chose to use an alum tawed skin, which is a skin like a leather, but produced a little bit differently.
Goat?
It's goat, yes.
Goat.
It's beautiful white alum tawed goat skin. And often when people do these sort of conservation bindings on medieval books, they leave the skin in the cream colour that it arrives in. However, I knew that it was likely to have been red.
Oh.
And coincidentally, we had a visit from a specialist in medieval pigments, a conservator by the name of Cheryl Porter, and she talked about medieval dyeing practice, and we had a bit of a play, and I just thought, look, I'm going to make it red. So we've used a wood known as Brazil wood, and I soaked and gently simmered it for a long time. And the slide there shows the first coat, which was actually quite hair-raising because it didn't come out red, it came out sort of yellowy orange. Oh. But then it slowly changed colour as the aluminium in the skin worked as a mordant and changed the colour to that beautiful orangey red. So it took 10 coats to build the colour up to that intensity that I wanted.
Okay. And all the time, the clock is ticking because you need to get it ready for the exhibition, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
Yes.
Great.
So here are the skins on the binding, and I'm doing the corners.
Go on.
What else to say there?
And
there
it is.
There's the finished binding. So you can see the sewing
Yes.
hidden behind the leather, and the lovely red from Brazil wood, which was a pigment. A dye that was used at the time. Yeah.
Remarkable.
And yeah, the binding is sort of totally reversible, so you can just cut a few things and it's
It's
free.
pops out.
If anyone wants to do something different later on, it's
easy. It's easy.
Not harmed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Shall we? That's.
Yeah, yep.
Oh, there we go. This is.
Oh, that's okay. We
That's
were
okay?
just showing some images of it on display within exhibitions, but
Yeah,
I think we can...
Oh my gosh, what have I done? Will I be able to do this? I think we should think of a question, ladies and gentlemen. Can you think of a question for Anna or for Katrina about the book? Yeah, thank you very much. That's what we wanted, yeah? I think so.
It hasn't come back.
No. Oh, it hasn't come back?
No. Anyway.
There's a question down. Yes?
Does the book include...
Hey, wait a minute.
Oh, gosh, okay. 700-year-old microphone. Does the book include funeral and wedding services, or is it just the pure standard mass services?
It doesn't have. No, it does. Hang on, let me think of the best way. Yes, it does have the text that you would use to perform those masses. Yes, but it doesn't have it. It's not written out as a whole mass. The way the book works is a bit. You have to flick backwards and forwards to different sections to kind of construct the mass that you need. But the prayers are there for those masses, yeah, and for burials and all the major sacraments of life. Yeah.
There's other questions in here in the centre. Oh yes.
Yeah, we certainly do keep all of the documentation. At the moment, the documentation stays in the conservation department, but anything that was removed from the manuscript has travelled back to the rare books department and has its own shelf number.
But this is an interesting question about whether is it actually part of the book? So, for example, the Flea. Does that, if suddenly the friars down here say, oh, look, we would like the book back, does the Flea go back and all the hairs?
Yeah,
it's all the book.
Yeah, it's all part of the book, absolutely.
Wow.
Stored separately.
Yeah, so it's stored separately. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes?
What would you say the value of the book would be?
Look, every medieval manuscript is really a unique item, so they're all high value items. But I guess it has a value for insurance purposes, but we don't think of it in those terms of value. Within the context of the collection, it's about its cultural and spiritual and historical value, more so than any financial. Ultimately, all medieval books are irreplaceable because they're all unique.
Could I just ask, would the book have a provenance? You know how it would, like paintings and that would have a provenance. Would this have one as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And we skipped over some of the evidence of that. But yeah, there are some, as I was saying, we know that it was made and used in Perugia. Then we have a big gap in the historical record until it turns up in the bookseller's inventory of a bookseller in Rome in 1798. Before then, there are a couple of notes in the manuscript that show that it's been in monastic libraries in Italy, but we don't know exactly which ones. But we've actually published an article detailing the provenance record of it. I can give you the details if you're interested to read it later. So
we'd assume that it stayed in Italy, moved up and around in Italy in that time?
Probably. Look, it's probably fallen out of use with the Council of Trent in 1540s. 1540s. And that council, which was largely a response to the Reformation and a sort of, it was a reformation within the Catholic Church. One of the results of it was a new missal that was written and sent out. And so a lot of books fell out of use after that new missal came out because you couldn't update them. You actually needed a new book. So probably it stopped being used around 1570. But it's all guesswork, really. And that's where, as a historian, it's so valuable to be able to work with a conservator like Katrina to learn as much as we can from the material clues that tell us more than sometimes we can tell just from what's written in the book.
Katrina, could I ask you, is there evidence of when the pages would have been cut? Because I can see that it is trimmed. Whereas originally, possibly, it wouldn't have been so neat.
Yeah, I suspect Bretherton may have cut it. It may have been cut several times. I mean, it's common bookbinding practice if you've got it damaged. Well, it was common bookbinding practice to neaten things up. You use your plough is the technical term. It's like a spoke shave, cutting the edges of the book to clean it up. So it may have been trimmed in the mid-19th century, or it may have been early. I mean, it may have been bound a number of times.
So that wouldn't have happened immediately after they finished all the artwork.
No. They wouldn't have cut through the artwork they just finished, though. That's definitely the sign of a later binder. So when there was an image that showed part of the penwork initial just sliced off, Unfortunately, that's a feature of 19th century book collecting.
19th century book
When books were rebound, they were often rebound to fit on a certain shelf size. So that might mean, I know, it's a tragedy. But it's evidence of the different ways in which this book has been used and understood over the centuries, that what seems like vandalism to us didn't seem like vandalism at the time. And in fact, many of these books have survived because people like Phillips collected them. Phillips was virulently anti-Catholic. He specifically wrote that Catholics weren't allowed into his library, and that a couple of times he tried to sell his books to the Bodleian, and one of the stipulations was no Catholics, and they kept saying, sorry, no. So it's an interesting sort of fact that he ended up preserving many, many Catholic medieval manuscripts, which otherwise may not have survived to us.
Fantastic. But at the beginning, when it was made into, when all the artwork was done and the lettering, that would have chopped off the pointy bits of the skin, the goat skin.
I think that would have happened before.
It would have been trimmed before it was...
Before it got to the scribe and the illuminator. It would have been trimmed into a page.
Yep. Great. Is that... Oh, there's one more up there in the corner. We might call that the last question for the night.
Sorry, you said if Bretherton didn't ascribe any religious value to the books, then why would he have thought them valuable enough to collect?
Phillips, Bretherton was his binder. That's right. No, Phillips was, he was obsessed with manuscripts. He loved manuscripts. And I suppose, I don't want to get into the complexities of the Reformation, but there's an argument for saying he wouldn't have seen them as Catholic books. He saw them as Christian sacred books, and he was a Christian. He just wasn't of the Catholic Church. He was a Protestant. So he wouldn't necessarily have seen a problem there, because he saw them as books within his own religious tradition and the Catholics as the erroneous offshoot.
That is an excellent note. I think erroneous offshoots on which to end. I invite you all to come up. We're going to go across the foyer and up to the next level up, and that's where the books will be on view, and you can speak to Anna and Katrina there. Let's thank Anna and Katrina for their contribution tonight. See you next time at the State Library of Victoria.